They told him the war was already over before it started. He went anyway. The message had come in across every open frequency at once, not encoded, compressed, just broadcast in clean, cold electromagnetic pulses that every human dish and antenna on Earth swallowed simultaneously. The translation software took 11 seconds. 11 seconds to render 3 sentences from a language that folded, meaning the way origami folds, paper, each symbol containing a dozen nested implications depending on how you oriented it. We have observed you for 400 of your years. We have measured you and found you insufficient. You will surrender the resonance keys or be consumed. Kai Drayson was 17 years old when the message came. He was sitting in the back of an agricultural transport outside of Novo Recife, eating a cold meat sandwich his mother had packed, watching the red hills blur past, and thinking about a girl from his training cohort named Sana, who had a laugh that could knock your legs out from under you. He heard the broadcast on his earpiece. Every civilian channel had been commandeered, and he stopped chewing and sat very still and stared out the scratched plasteel window and thought, so that's that then. He finished the sandwich, not out of bravery, not defiance, just because it was good and he was hungry and wasting it seemed stupid. That particular stubbornness. The refusal to surrender something small just because something large was pressing down on you would turn out to be the most important thing about Kai Drayson. But he didn't know that yet. He was just a kid with a cold sandwich and a secondhand earpiece, and a 3-month stint on a rural labor rotation, waiting to qualify for the technical academies. Not a soldier, not particularly brave. He'd lost more fights than he'd won. In the processing yards where the labor crews made their own hierarchy, and his younger brother had called him soft more than once, not cruelly, just with the frank disappointment that only siblings can weaponize. He took karate classes twice a week from an old retired defense contractor named Mira, who taught out of a converted grain storage unit. He was mediocre at it. He knew he was mediocre at it. He showed up anyway twice a week because Mira had told him on his first day that the ones who showed up without talent were more interesting than the ones who didn't need to, and that had seemed to him like the truest thing an adult had said to him in years. The transport had 23 other workers in it, and after the broadcast came through, they all looked at each other, and then at their devices, and then at the red hills, and nobody said anything for a long time. There was a woman 2 seats up who started crying very quietly, pressing her wrist to her mouth. There was an older man across the aisle who put his earpiece in his breast pocket and closed his eyes and appeared to simply go to sleep. Kai watched them and thought about his mother back in Novo Recife, who would be watching the news feeds and calculating structural redundancies in her head the way she did when she was frightened, because civil engineers under stress think about load-bearing systems. Pulled out his comm and sent her a message that said, "I'm fine." She sent back, "I know. Stay where you are. Then, finish your rotation. It's what you went there to do." He appreciated that. It was exactly the right thing to say. The Ven Kothar, the species that had sent the message, were not mediocre at anything. They were the kind of old that makes civilizations feel like children's drawings. Their ships had been detected at the outer edge of the system 7 weeks before the broadcast. Great dark geometric structures that caught light. Wrong, that absorbed certain wavelengths and reflected others in patterns the humans xenoastrophysicists kept describing as deliberate. And then, explain further. They had not communicated. They had not moved. They had simply waited with the patience of something that has never been in a hurry, because nothing has ever been able to threaten it. The resonance keys they demanded were artifacts. That was the translation. The actual Ven Kothar concept was more layered. Objects that existed partially outside normal spacetime, that could be used as tuning forks to access frequencies of reality that human science had not yet formally acknowledged existed. The keys had been found, separately, in excavations on 2 different continents and 1 deep-sea site over the course of 60 years. They looked, human eyes like rings, heavy, dark, slightly warm to the touch. The metal was not any known alloy. The engraving on their inner surfaces was not any known script. They had been in a museum in Johannesburg, and a military research facility in Kazakhstan, and in a private collection in Vancouver, And now they were in the hands of the Interplanetary Defense Council, locked in a vault, while 70 nations argued about what to do with them. What no one except a small group of researchers and one old man had understood until very recently was that one of the keys had been activated, stolen from its display case in Johannesburg 18 months ago, by a man who knew exactly what he was taking. His name was Rael Vaughn. He was by any measure brilliant. He had spent 12 years inside the academic military complex, studying xenoarchaeology, before deciding that the institutions that employed him were too slow, too cautious, too committed to collective decision-making to ever actually use what they'd found. He had watched committee after committee look at the keys and produce reports and schedule follow-on committees, and something in him had passed a threshold that he could not precisely locate afterward and did not try to. He had decided, with the clean logic of someone who has spent too long alone with large ideas, that the power offered by the keys should belong to whoever was bold enough to claim it. He stole the first one the same night he resigned his position. He left his access card on his desk, and his research notes in a folder labeled FR. Whoever finds this, and he walked out through a side entrance at 2 in the morning with the ring in his jacket pocket, and his hand around it was not shaking. By the time anyone noticed, he had already begun the work of learning to use it. The key responded to him. That was the terrifying thing. It should not have. Everything in the research suggested that the keys had some form of compatibility requirement, some threshold of whatever the Ven Kothar used instead of intention. And Vaughn did not meet it cleanly. He was brilliant and determined, and entirely without doubt, and the key gave him something. Not what it would give to the right person. Something partial, leveraged, borrowed. Enough to disappear from tracking systems. Enough to move through secure facilities, without leaving the signatures that surveillance looked for. Enough to fight with a speed and precision that made trained security teams feel like they were moving through water. Enough to find the second key and understand, bone deep, that without it he would remain only partial. He needed the second key. The second key was around Kai Drazen's wrist on a leather cord, and Kai Drazen had no idea what it was. He'd been given it by an old man on a road 2 months before the Ven Kothar broadcast. Not even given, pressed. The old man had been on the ground. When Kai found him, 3 laborers from a different crew standing over him, one of them holding the man's small pack, another with a boot raised. Kai had not thought carefully about what he did next. He had not run a calculation or consulted his ethics training or thought about the odds. He had just moved toward it because a person was on the ground and other people were causing that. And the math of that situation had felt, to him, like it only resolved one way. He'd taken 2 hits before the laborers decided he wasn't worth it. The old man had pressed the cord into his hand, while Kai sat against the road barrier bleeding from his lower lip, and said something Kai had only partly understood. The explanation is too simple for you right now. When you need it, it will be there. The old man had been small, and very old, with hands like something carved out of a tough wood. He had looked at Kai with the specific attention of someone who has been looking for a particular face for a very long time, and has finally found it in an unexpected place. He had seemed in that moment on the side of the road with the sun going sideways through the dust, neither relieved nor particularly happy, just finished. The way a person looks when they've completed something they set out to do a long time ago. He died 3 days later, in a hospice in the nearest city, before Kai could get back with questions. The nurses said he'd been very old and very sick, and had been looking, they thought, for someone. They said he seemed peaceful when he went. Said he'd asked them to make sure the young man who'd visited got his message. The message was a single line on a folded piece of paper. It said, "It was always in you. The ring only showed you where to look." Kai had found the encryption useful, and had put it in his pocket and mostly forgotten about it. He'd worn the ring because it fit, and because it was warm in a way that felt reassuring rather than alarming, and because he'd had it long enough that removing it felt like losing something. He couldn't explain any of those reasons to his brother, asked about it once and then let it go. He thought of the old man's message the morning after the Ven Kothar broadcast. When he woke at 4 in the morning in his bunk at the labor camp, sweating through his shirt, absolute certainty that something was coming for him. Not a dream, not anxiety. Something more solid than either. A knowledge, the kind that sits in the sternum rather than the skull. He put his hand to the cord at his wrist. The ring was warm. Rael Vaughn moved like a weather system. That was how people described him afterward. The ones who survived. Not like a soldier. Not like a trained fighter. Like something with its own pressure and inevitability. He'd been moving through the civilian evacuation networks in South America for 3 weeks. Following a trace that the first key was giving him, a low electromagnetic signal like a compass needle that kept swinging south and west toward the labor settlements outside Novo Recife. He moved at night. He moved around people, not through them, when he could. He had not wanted this to be bloody. He had wanted, sincerely, to simply convince whoever carried the second key of the logic of his position. One person, one unified will, 2 combined keys, and humanity would have a weapon against the Venkothar instead of a negotiating token. He believed this. That was the frightening part. He was not cruel for cruelty's sake. He was a man who had simplified a very complex moral landscape down to one urgent priority and had stopped being able to see the things he'd pushed to the edges. The Venkothar were coming. The collective deliberation bodies were useless. The clock was running. Someone had to act, and he was capable of acting, and capability had always been his logic for everything. He found the labor camp in the gray hour before dawn. He found Kai's bunk by following the signal. It was precise enough now, with the first key fully calibrated, to locate him within meters. He stood in the doorway and looked at the young man sitting upright on the mattress, one hand on a cord at his wrist, staring at nothing, and he felt the signal from the first key light up in his chest, like a second heartbeat, young, slight, dried blood on his lip from something recent. He had expected someone older. He had expected, in the deep background, someone more obviously equipped for what they were carrying. "You don't know what you have," Vaughn said. Kai looked at him. He was not, he would admit later, particularly frightened in that moment. He was mostly confused, and underneath the confusion there was that new thing at his sternum, that warm certainty, which was telling him something that his brain hadn't yet organized into words. "I've got a general idea," Kai said. "Then you understand why I need it. I understand why you want it." There was a small difference in those 2 sentences, and they both heard it. Vaughn's expression shifted. Something that might have been respect, briefly, before it resolved back to purpose. He crossed the room in the time it takes to blink, and reached for Kai's wrist. What happened next, Kai could not fully account for afterward. Not then, not for months. He knew that his body moved. He knew that it moved correctly, not with any technique Mira had managed to drill into him in that converted grain silo, but with something deeper and more precise, something that seemed to come up through the floor and through his legs and his spine, and his arm was not where Vaughn's hand expected it to be, and Vaughn overcorrected, and Kai was already somewhere else. 12 seconds in a dark bunk room in Novo Recife. Kai Drayson was the most dangerous person in it. Then Vaughn found his center again, and the 12 seconds ended. He took Kai apart with an almost academic efficiency. Not brutally, he didn't want him dead, just pacified, but completely. Left him on the floor in the narrow space between his bunk and the wall, gasping, the ring on his wrist pulsing warm in a way that felt absurdly like apology. Vaughn crouched over him. "This doesn't have to be violent," he said. "I need the second key to complete the resonance. With both keys, I can access the Venkothar frequency directly, not submit to them. Surrender the keys, not bargain from weakness. Strike from a position no one has imagined yet. One human will, undiluted, uncompromised." Kai lay there and breathed. His ribs were not broken, but they were having a strong opinion about existence. "And if you're wrong," he said, "I'm not wrong. But if you are..." Vaughn looked at him for a moment. "Then we're all dead anyway. We're all dead anyway under the alternative." He left without the ring. He didn't understand why he left without the ring. His hand had reached for it, twice, and both times something had stalled in him. Not conscience, not hesitation. Something more like the first key, pulling back, refusing, communicating something in whatever register it used that functioned like a warning. He stood in the doorway for 2 seconds and felt it. This refusal from the thing he wore, and he looked back at the young man on the floor. and tried to read what it was that the key was responding to in him. He couldn't see it. He had never been good at seeing what he couldn't categorize. He left. The camp woke up at 6. Nobody else had heard anything. Kai sat in the communal wash station and rinsed his face for a long time, and then stood with his hands on the basin and looked at himself in a metal-polished mirror that served as the camp's communal reflective surface. He looked like what he was, a mediocre karate student from a rural labor rotation with dried blood on his lip and a thing on his wrist he didn't understand. He thought about the old man's message. He thought about Vaughn's logic, which was not, he admitted to himself, entirely without merit. The Venkothar had given humanity no window for collective deliberation. They had given a demand and a timeline. 22 days. He put in for emergency transport authorization and told his section supervisor he had a family matter in Johannesburg. She gave him the form and did not ask questions. The whole world was rearranging its priorities that week. He thought about what it had felt like, 12 seconds, when his body had simply known what to do. Not the ring's power flooding him the way Vaughn used the first key. Nothing that dramatic, nothing borrowed. Something his own. Something that had always been there and had needed. What? Not a shortcut. A mirror. He wrapped his hand around the ring and felt it pulse twice, slow like a heartbeat he recognized. Then, he found his section supervisor and told her he needed transport to Johannesburg. The Defense Council's Xenoarchaeology Division operated out of a building that had, before the Venkothar broadcast, been a mid-tier government research campus, and had since been converted into the kind of controlled chaos that happens when every timeline faces simultaneously. The corridors were full of people moving too fast in too many directions, and the smell of recycled air and cold coffee, and the very specific anxiety of people who know more about the danger than anyone else was everywhere. Dr. Lena Voss had been part of the original team that cataloged the keys, and she had not slept in 4 days, and she was not. She explained to Kai with considerable force, authorized to speak to civilians who showed up unannounced. Then she saw the ring. "Do you get that?" she said. A question. "Old man. Rode outside Novo Recife. He died." She stared at him. She had the look of a person running rapid calculations and arriving at answers she didn't want. "Who are you?" "Kai Drayson. I'm on a labor rotation. Took karate twice a week and I'm about average at it. I'm from Novo Recife originally. My mother is a civil engineer. My brother thinks I'm soft." He paused. "I don't think the ring was supposed to go to someone important. I think the old man was running out of time, and I was the person in front of him." Lena Voss pulled a chair out from the nearest workstation and sat down in it with the slightly controlled collapse of a person whose legs have been making threats all day. She pressed both hands flat on her thighs and stared at the floor for a moment and then looked back up at him. "Keys are not separate artifacts," she said. "We thought they were for a long time. 2 separate discoveries, 2 separate histories, 2 separate," she stopped. "They're one system. We worked that out 8 months ago. One key is a receiver, the other is an amplifier. Together, they establish a resonance link, not to the Venkothar communication frequency, nothing that simple, to something the Venkothar use to enforce their territorial claims. A frequency that their colonization technology runs on. If someone could access it, they could disrupt it," Kai said, "or weaponize it. Which is what Vaughn is trying to do. Is he wrong about it being possible?" "No." She said it flatly. "No hedge. He's not wrong about the capability. He's wrong about what it costs. The resonance link requires a complete resonance. Not partial, not borrowed, not forced. The keys were designed, built, encoded, shaped, to respond to something specific. We thought it was biology. We thought maybe it was neurochemistry or genetic structure from some older, human lineage. We were wrong about that too." She looked at his wrist. "It's not what you are, it's how you are." Kai looked down at the ring. "That's not very specific." "No," she agreed. "The Venkothar don't think in our specifics. They think in orientations. How a mind is turned. Whether a person has, they have a word for it. It translates roughly as self-location. Knowing where you are, not geographically, not socially essentially. Knowing what you actually are, rather than what you've decided to perform." She studied him. "Vaughn is the most capable person I've ever assessed. He's also the most thoroughly lost. He knows exactly what he wants. He has no idea who he is." Kai was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a delivery drone passed at eye level, and then dropped away below the building's edge and was gone. What happens if he gets both keys? He achieves the resonance, he accesses the frequency. With his orientation, she stopped. What? The Venkothar used this frequency to establish dominance, to override the will of less complex systems. If Vaughn accesses it with his particular shape of self, his drive to impose a single undiluted will on a problem. She pressed her fingers to her mouth briefly. He doesn't become a weapon against the Venkothar. He becomes a mechanism that mirrors them. The resonance would amplify what he is. He would become exactly what he's trying to fight. The room was full of the hum of servers and the distant sounds of people talking at high speed in multiple languages. 22 days, Kai said. 19 now, and the actual intended use, what you think the keys were for. She hesitated. This was the part she had been turning over for months. The interpretation that felt both too large and too small, at the same time, the conclusion she kept arriving at, and kept double-checking, because it implied things about the nature of the universe that made the back of her mind go quiet in a way she didn't entirely like. We think, and this is speculative, this is interpretation of artifacts from a civilization that doesn't think the way we do. We think the keys were a test. Left here, specifically, us specifically, for the species that would need to use them against the Venkothar. She exhaled. The Venkothar have a mythology. It's not mythology the way we use the word. It's cosmological history, their record of what has actually happened. In their records, every species they've consumed has eventually produced a counter-resonance, a frequency that cancels their dominance signal. Every species. And the counter-resonance, without exception, has come from a single individual who had self-location, Kai said. Yes, knows what they are. Yes. He looked at the ring for a long time. Outside the window, the sky over Johannesburg was the particular flat white of high overcast, diffuse and total, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been pressed between glass. I need somewhere to practice, he said. I can give you a warehouse, she said, 3 floors down. But Kai, this isn't something you can practice your way to. You either have it or you don't, and the ring will tell you which. I know, he said. I just need somewhere to be quiet. Mira had taught him. In the converted grain silo, with its smell of old dust and machine oil, and the particular silence of rural places at night, that the body knows more than the brain most of the time. And the brain's job is not to lead, but to get out of the way. She had not framed it in those terms exactly. She was a practical woman who taught practical things and had no patience for mysticism. But the principle was there in every drill. Stop thinking about the move. Let the response come up. Trust the structure. He had been mostly too much in his head to do this well. He'd watched other students in Mira's class achieve the quality she described, that specific unself-conscious competence, and felt like he was watching through glass. He could perform the techniques. He could not inhabit them. He had always known what to do. He had never been entirely sure how to be the person doing it. For 3 days, in a warehouse 3 floors below the Defense Council Research Campus, he worked alone with the ring on his wrist, and tried to find what Lena Voss had called self-location. He was not sure what he was doing. He ran forms until he stopped being able to count repetitions. He worked on the small things. The moment before a strike, quality of balance between movements, the thing Mira had called the still point. He ran until his legs gave out, and then he sat on the concrete floor and breathed and pressed his back against the cool wall and let his mind empty. The ring pulsed. Slow, regular, like something listening. He thought about the first day he'd walked into Mira's silo and how he'd looked at the other students. Some of them clearly talented, moving with the ease of people who had always been comfortable in their own bodies and had felt the familiar gap between what he could observe and what he could do. He'd thought then, I'll never be that. He'd come back the next session anyway, and the one after. He couldn't explain why exactly. It seemed important not to let the gap be the reason he stopped. That was the closest he could get to articulating it. On the second night, he thought about his brother calling him soft, and why that had stuck. Not because it was cruelly meant. Because there was a question behind it that his brother was too young to articulate. Is soft the same as weak? And the honest answer was, It depends on what kind of pressure you're under. Soft things absorb force. Hard things fracture. The trick is knowing what you're made of. On the third night, he sat in the dark with a piece of flat metal from the warehouse floor in his hand. He'd been using it as an improvised weight for grip exercises. And he held it and thought about the old man on the road, and why he'd moved toward the trouble rather than away from it. And it wasn't complicated. A person was being hurt and Kai happened to be there, and he didn't see how that was a calculation. It just was what it was. No glory in it, no performance. Just the fact of it. The ring went very warm. His hand flat on the floor. He felt something he would spend years trying to describe and eventually give up on. The word he landed closest to was alignment. Like two gears that have been spinning near each other finally catching teeth. Like a tuning fork held against a surface that resonates at its frequency. Like the moment in a form when every limb is in the right place at the right time, and the whole body is a single statement. The ring did not give him power. It confirmed that the power was his. There is a significant difference. He called Lena Voss. I think I'm ready, he said, or as ready as I'm going to be. Vaughn's signal appeared in the city this morning, she said. He's close. Yeah, Kai said. I know. He did know. The ring was telling him, not in words or images but in direction, the way a compass tells you north. He could feel the first key's presence in the city, like a temperature change, like pressure behind the eyes, like the feeling before a storm. He got up and found the jacket he'd folded for a pillow and put it on and sat in the warehouse for another 10 minutes, not preparing, not steeling himself, just being where he was, breathing. Feeling the floor under him, and the air around him, and the ring warm on his wrist, and the specific quiet of a person who is about to do something difficult, and has made a reasonable peace with that. Then he went. He found Vaughn on the observation deck of one of the old commercial towers in the financial district, at the elevated walkway that connected two buildings 40 stories above the street. The sky was still that flat, white, the overcast holding the city spread below them in every direction. The late afternoon light diffused into a sourceless glow that fell equally on everything, erasing shadows, making the whole world look like a single exposed surface. Vaughn was looking at the city when Kai came through the door. He didn't turn immediately. He stood with his hands at his sides, the first key on his right hand, and he said without turning, "You figured it out." "Some of it," Kai said. "Then you understand I'm not the villain of this." "I understand you think that." Vaughn turned. He looked older than he had in the bunk room in Novo Recife. Or maybe just more tired. There was something worn around his eyes that Kai recognized from people who had been carrying something alone for too long. He had the posture of a man who has been moving at speed for so long that stopping feels dangerous. Because stopping means the thing he's been outrunning might catch up. "The Ven Kothar will not negotiate," Vaughn said. "I've studied their behavior across 6 other first contact scenarios in the archive. Every single one ends the same way. Consumption, absorption. The species either provides the resources demanded or ceases to be a species. There is no third path on their terms." His voice was precise, controlled, and underneath it the specific vibration of a person who has been right about everything for so long that being right has become its own kind of cage. "My way creates a third path. Your way requires you to stop being what you are," Kai said. "Hold 2 keys at once that are designed to amplify what you're oriented toward. You'd become," Lena said, "you'd become a mirror of them. What you want to destroy." She doesn't know that for certain. No, but you do. You know the research better than anyone. That's why you're still standing here instead of just taking the ring. A very long pause. Below them, somewhere in the city's afternoon noise, a siren moved from one direction to another and faded. "Yes," Vaughn said finally. He sounded, for the first time, not like a man certain of his position, but like a man who has built a structure he can no longer see the outside of. "I know it's a risk. You're not built for it," Kai said. "Not cruelty, just the fact of it. You're brilliant, and you're capable, and you care about what happens to people. That part is true. I can see it. But you've decided what the right answer is, and you'll bend everything to fit it, including yourself. That's not self-location. That's the opposite." "And you," Vaughn said. "You're a 17-year-old on a labor rotation who barely passed his karate assessments. You think you're built for it?" "I don't know," Kai said. I know I'm not trying to be anything other than what I am. He said it without drama, without the cadence of someone making a speech. Just a statement fact the way you might describe the weather. The ring on his wrist flared. Not warmly this time. Brighter. A resonance that traveled up his arm and through his chest and down into his legs. And he felt the alignment from the warehouse, the gears catching teeth, arrive fully, completely, with a solidity that felt like the floor had thickened beneath him. Vaughn moved. He was everything the research suggested. Preternaturally fast, the borrowed power of the first key, compressing his reaction time into something non-human, covered the distance between them, and struck in a single, unbroken motion that a trained security professional would not have been able to track. Kai was not there when he arrived. Not teleportation, not speed that matched Vaughn's, not anything supernatural. He had simply read the motion, read the compression in Vaughn's posture, the micro-shift of weight, the slight turn of shoulder, and the body that Mira had trained imperfectly for 2 years. And that had spent 3 days in a warehouse finding what it actually was, responded correctly. He moved through Vaughn's strike like water, finding gaps in stone. They traded exchanges in the flat white afternoon light 40 stories above Johannesburg, and it was not a clean fight, and it was not an equal fight. And Vaughn won the first minute, and the second minute, and most of the third. Kai hit the barrier railing twice, and the floor once and the door frame once. His face was bleeding again. That same lower lip, he was beginning to feel, was a particular cosmic commentary on something. But he got back up each time, and he moved through it. Not with Vaughn's terrible borrowed precision, but with something else, something persistent and absorptive and stubbornly, fundamentally unfrightened. Not brave, just honest about what was happening. The difference mattered. Brave implies you considered the alternative. Kai, in those minutes on the walkway, could not sincerely consider the alternative. It did not present itself to him as an option. He was here. This was happening, and the only direction available was through it. The 4th minute Vaughn stopped trying to disable him and started trying to get the ring. The first keys pulled toward the second had become strong enough to move him past strategy into something more like a gravity. He struck for the ring in a sequence of 3 fast-controlled motions, each designed to isolate the wrist and strip the cord. Kai caught his wrist on the 3rd attempt. Not a trained lock, not a technique, just the body doing what it saw needed doing. And in the fraction of a second of contact, the 2 keys were 3 inches apart for the first time. Vaughn felt it immediately. His whole body went rigid, not with pain, but with something else. The first key were responding to the proximity of the second, with a resonance that moved through him like a current through a wire. He had felt power before, the borrowed partial power he'd operated on for 18 months. This was the other thing. This was what it was supposed to feel like. This was the actual frequency. He understood in that 3-inch moment exactly what Lena Voss had been trying to tell him. The resonance amplified what you were. What he was in that moment was a man with no room in him for anything except the one thing he'd decided mattered. The frequency would have gone in and found that and made it everything. Not a weapon, not a resistance, just a single voice, and that voice was his. And it sounded exactly like the Venkathar's dominant signal, and the difference between them would have been too small to matter. He released his wrist. The resonance was not an explosion. It was not dramatic in any visible way. It was a sound below the threshold of hearing, felt rather than perceived, and it traveled outward from the walkway at the speed of whatever it was. Not light, not sound, something the physics of the situation didn't have a clean name for. It hit the city's communications infrastructure and passed through it without disturbing a single signal. It hit the Venkothar ships at the edge of the system 37 minutes later, moving at a velocity that the astrophysicist would argue about for a decade. What it carried was the resonance imprint of Kai Drayson, 17 years old, labor rotation, average karate student, person who had moved toward a man on the ground because it seemed like the only logical response. Person who had finished a sandwich because wasting it was stupid. Person who did not know what he was going to become, but was thoroughly, precisely, unperformatively clear about what he was right now. The Venkathar frequency, the one their colonization technology used, the one their dominance signal ran on. The one that had consumed 6 civilizations in the records, and an unknown number before that, encountered the counter-resonance and went quiet. Not destroyed. Not annihilated. Quiet. The way a tuning fork goes quiet when you hold the right surface against it. Venkathar ships did not leave. They were not frightened. Beings that old do not frighten easily. What they did. What the monitoring stations registered over the following 72 hours. Was something the analysis teams eventually translated as reorientation. The ships changed their angle, not retreating, reconsidering, and in the Venkothar's cosmological history, their unbroken record of what had actually happened. The data point they had been waiting 400 years to collect finally resolved. On the walkway 40 stories above Johannesburg, Vaughn sat with his back against the railing and his hands open on the floor, first key dark and cool in his palm. The borrowed power was gone. He looked without it, simply like a tired man in his 40s, who had been carrying something alone for too long. Kai sat across from him and breathed and pressed the back of his wrist to his lip. I was right about the capability, Vaughn said. Yes. Wrong about who should hold it. Yes. A long silence, pigeons somewhere below them, the city's low-registered noise. I would have been consumed, Vaughn said. It was not a question. He said it the way you say a thing when you've known it for some time, and are finally permitting yourself to hear it out loud. I don't know, Kai said honestly. Maybe Lena thinks so. You probably know better than both of us. I know, Vaughn said. He turned the first key in his fingers. It caught the flat white light and held it for a moment, and then didn't. I felt it. In that second when they were close together, I felt what it was going to do with me. What it was going to make of me. He set the key on the floor between them. I would have been very good at it. That was the worst part. I would have been exactly as effective as the thing I was trying to stop. I know, Kai said. Another silence. What happens now, Vaughn said. I have no idea, Kai said. I'm 17 and I'm supposed to report back to my labor rotation in 8 days, and I still haven't qualified for the technical academies. Vaughn looked at him. For the first time since the bunk room in Novo Recife, something in his face changed. The long tension around his eyes releasing slightly into something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. The girl, he said. The one you were thinking about on the transport. Kai blinked. How do you? The first key. It showed me things about the second key's carrier. Context. Enough to understand what I was dealing with. He paused. You should talk to her. That's your advice, after all of this. You move towards something difficult without running a calculation, Vaughn said. You do that with her too. Stop waiting to have better odds. Kai stared at him. The Venkothar Armada is at the edge of the solar system and you're giving me romantic advice. The Venkothar are thinking, Vaughn said. That'll take them a while. You've got time. He picked up the first key and held it out. Kai looked at it. You should keep it, Kai said. Vaughn shook his head. It was never mine. It was keeping me functional. Now it's done. He placed it in Kai's hand. Give it to Voss. Let the researchers have both of them. Let the collective work it out. He said this last part with only a little visible pain. The pain of a person who still believes in the value of unilateral action, but has just spent 40 minutes against a 17-year-old being educated in its limits. Below them, Johannesburg went about the business of still existing. Somewhere in the city, Lena Voss was watching a bank of monitors and seeing frequency readings that had no precedent in the archive. Somewhere in the solar system, 7 Venkothar ships were doing whatever beings that age do when they need to reconsider a 400-year assumption. Somewhere in Novo Recife, Sana was presumably doing whatever she was doing, unaware that a person she'd trained with had just been a very important instrument in a very quiet event. Kai stood up. His ribs were going to make the next week uncomfortable. His lip had stopped bleeding. He looked out at the city for a moment. At the flat, white sky and the buildings and the particular living chaos of a few million people going about. Work of being alive, and he felt the ring pulse one last time, slow and warm, and then go still. Not dead, resting, the way something rests us when it has done what it was for. He put both keys in his jacket pocket and went to find Lena Voss. 6 months later, the Venkothar sent second message. It was longer than the first. The translation software took 3 days. The meaning was, essentially, this: we have observed the counter-resonance. We acknowledge the pattern. We will reopen negotiation parameters. They used a Venkothar term for what Kai had demonstrated, what the keys had amplified and broadcast. The translation was argued over for weeks. Closest rendering the xenolinguistics team settled on was not heroism, not bravery, not power. Those were the obvious guesses, the ones everyone had expected. The word translated as being present. Present without performance, present without borrowed strength, present in the specific human way, which the Venkothar had, over 400 years of observation, come to understand, was rarer in the universe than they had initially assessed. Not because humans were special by nature, but because humans were, more often than most species, capable of the particular quality of showing up fully as what they were, in the specific moment that required it, without the mediation of what they wished they were, or what they feared they might be. The Venkothar had consumed 6 civilizations. Every one of them had eventually produced this quality. The counter-resonance, the individual who achieved complete self-location under ultimate pressure. It had always ended the same way. The frequency had gone quiet. The Venkothar had reoriented. The xenolinguistics team asked whether this meant they would have left anyway, regardless of what humanity did, whether it was a test with a predetermined outcome. The Venkothar's response translated, "There is no such thing as a test with a predetermined outcome. The outcome is the test." Kai Drayson took the Technical Academy qualifying exam in the spring. He passed it with middling scores on everything except applied systems theory, where he scored in the top percentile, possibly because applied systems theory is, at its core, about understanding the conditions under which a structure operates at its actual capacity, rather than its theoretical one, which was a thing he had, by that point, some experience with. Lena Voss sent him a message the morning his scores came in. It said, "Told you, Mira." When he went back to the converted grain silo to say goodbye before the academy term started, watched him run a form from the beginning of her curriculum, and made him run it again, and then said, "Better. Still from the head too much at the start." Then she paused and said, "You figured it out, though, in the end, didn't you?" It was not a question. He said, "I think so." She said, "It's not a thing you figure out once." He said, "I know." She said, "Good." She handed him his training card, marked complete. She had the handshake of someone who had spent a long life moving with intention, and she did not say anything else, because Mira never used 2 words where one would do, or 1 word where none was required. Rael Vaughn was tried by the Defense Council for the Johannesburg theft, and the actions in Novo, Recife, and 3 other incidents the security teams had managed to piece together. He pleaded guilty to all of them. At sentencing, he was asked if he had anything to say. He said, "Shh. I was right about the capability and wrong about who should hold it." He said nothing further. He was sentenced to 8 years in a research detention facility, which meant 8 years in the best xenolinguistics library on Earth, which was not, everyone understood, an accident. He came out of it having completed more translations of Venkar's secondary texts than the previous 3 research teams combined. Whatever argument he had with himself in those years, he never shared it. He came out of it with the specific look of a man who has found finally, somewhat late, a project that is actually his. Sana, when Kai talked to her, which he did. Eventually, after 6 months of working up to it, with the same reluctant persistence he'd brought to everything else, said, "I wondered when you were going to get around to this," he said. "It took me a while to stop calculating odds," she said. "Stop calculating odds generally or just about this specifically," he said. "Probably both," she laughed. It was the same laugh he'd been thinking about on the transport, the one that could knock your legs out from under you, and it was exactly what he remembered, and also better than he remembered. The way the things sometimes are when you actually let yourself get to them. The Venkothar, over the following 3 years, entered formal negotiation parameters for the first time in their recorded history. Not as equals. They would never pretend to view any younger species as fully equal, and humanity would have been idiotic to pretend otherwise, but as something they had no prior term for, and eventually coined a new one. The translation settled on parties who demonstrate the capacity for genuine presence, which is, depending on how you look at it, either a very small thing to have saved the world with or exactly the right size. The ring is in a research archive in Johannesburg. Both of them, together in a temperature-controlled case. They are warm to the touch still. The researchers note this in their cataloging. They have no explanation for it. They do not worry about it. Some things are just how they are.